Welcome. Today we're discussing Sharia, what it is, what it means, and what are its consequences for the West. Many of you are probably familiar with the expression Sharia law, and I think there's a perception, or perhaps it's a misconception in the West, that Sharia law is just a body of legal doctrines that some Muslim countries or some Muslim communities live under. In fact, Sharia is quite a bit more than that. It encompasses religion, philosophy, legal systems to be sure, but also customs, day-to-day behaviors, how people pray, how people eat, how people conduct themselves in their daily lives. So we want to understand it a little bit better. Today, I'm joined by our resident great legal mind, Mr. James Valliant. So, James, let's first of all give people a little bit of context of what Sharia refers to. So, the term means something like the path to the watering place or the well-trodden path to the watering place. Can you tell us just a little bit about what the term Sharia refers to, what it is, what it isn't, and historically what its significance has been for Muslims?
Well, the Quran and the Hadith, if people are not familiar with that, the Quran is the sacred text for Islam, the words of the Prophet himself, Muhammad. There are additional sayings, both by Muhammad and some of his followers, that are included in the sacred writings, but the lesser sacred traditions of the Hadith. And among the divisions within Islam, there are different Hadith that are respected, others that are ignored, depending which flavor Shia or Sunni Muslim you are. And it's developed over a period of centuries, actually, just as the Hadith themselves developed over a period of centuries. And as you point out, it's a legal code that specifies it's a much more detailed legal code than we are normally used to in the West. As you indicated, it indicates rules on everything. In the Jewish context, we have the Mosaic Law, and the Mosaic Jewish or Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy. That's a law code. It was meant to be a legal code enforced by the government, by a Jewish government. And similarly, not to mention the fact that Sharia law and the Quran are very deeply influenced by the Mosaic Law. Similarly, Sharia law is the legal code, the political side, if you will, of what we enforce as law within Muslim communities. That is different from Muslim community to Muslim community. But the idea of, it's funny, we were talking about the golden age of Islam, 1,000, from 800 to 1,200 years ago. The thing is that they really hadn't fully developed this notion of Sharia law. And that in part, I think, accounts for the golden age. They were not as oppressive as they later came to be within their governments. By the, say, it's funny because there's sort of a pattern going on in the world to the Western world. As the Western world goes into Renaissance, that is precisely when Sharia law gets really starts getting developed, and the development of it and the enforcement of it within the Islamic world becomes developed. As the Europeans go into an 18th century Enlightenment, the Muslim world, part of the Muslim world, for example, adopt Wahhabism, where to Arab Muslim, for example, in this extreme view of the demands of Islam, as the West was developing in an Enlightenment, mind you, as Christians and Jews were going through the 18th century, a very benevolent period in which Christians stopped torturing and burning people at the stake and things like that. So as the Christian and Jewish world in Europe is going through Enlightenment, and by the way, Reform Judaism is being created by Moses Mendelssohn in the 18th century. So both Christians and Jews in Europe are going through an Enlightenment. Wahhabism is taking over the Arab Muslim world. Now, in the Iranian context, they had always been, with their brand of Islam, a little more fundamentalistic. But in all of these cases, it's a blend, mind you, with the local traditions, and the demands of Islam. The demands of Islam have more and more and more taken up the demands of Sharia law, so that religious scholars, Islamic legal scholars, are in the last 200-300 years have demanded an enforced close affinity to the holy writings of Islam. This involves, as you marriage laws, treat children. Now, Sharia permits a degree of domestic violence. In some places, quite a degree of domestic violence against women. Women are, in effect, have no rights, and they are, in effect, enslaved. Slavery itself is okay in Sharia law. They have blasphemy laws. Again, blasphemy laws really weren't enforced during at least in a widespread way, during the Golden Age 1,000 years ago. Today, you will find blasphemy laws, apostasy laws. If you follow Islam, you're a criminal, you can be killed. There are places in the world, Iran, uh, Pakistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, where Islamic laws are actually part of the legal system, and Sharia is the inspiration for that. So you can be executed for blaspheming God, denying Islam, offending the Prophet, drawing, making a see. We're used to in the Jewish context, for example, making no graven images. Idol worship is a big no-no in the Jewish scriptures. That was imported and inherited by the Islamic religion, and they're so strict about it. You can't even any attempt to symbolically represent God is blasphemy. Any attempt to depict the prophet is blasphemy. So blasphemy gets you killed. And the punishments can vary, from stoning to hanging, but blasphemy can get you killed, apostasy can get you killed, domestic violence is permitted, slavery is permitted. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has ruled that Sharia law is inconsistent with human rights understood in the West, period. And I think that's correct. One international body that's got it right was the European Commission for Human Rights, which I think about 20 years ago declared Sharia law to be utterly inconsistent with the legal norms of the West. And I think that's true.
Well,
But as I say, there's been a demand with the rise of Wahhabism, and in particular in the 20th century, when it seized hold, I think of, in part, it was an anti when the Arabs themselves were being oppressed by the Ottoman Turks, they became much more fundamentalistic in their resistance to it. We all know the Arab revolt during World War I, Lawrence of Arabia. It was Wahhabism actually played a key role in that, just as Wahhabism played a key role in Afghanistani first to the Soviets, and then the emergence of Al Qaeda and the Taliban. These are the effusions of a religious fundamentalism that has been growing in the Muslim world for the last 200-300 years. And Sharia law is the demand to enact it into the laws of the government.
yeah. By the way, James, your internet is breaking up a little bit from time to time. I don't know if it would be helpful to turn your camera off, at least temporarily, to resolve the situation. But so there's quite a bit in what you just said that I'd like to pick up on. One thing that springs to mind is so Muslims regard Sharia as as divine, as of divine origin or divine inspiration. And yet there's always this necessity for human beings to interpret it. And I think the term is fiqh, that it's the interpretation of the divine law by actual human societies. And so you pointed out that there are different variants of Sharia. To my knowledge, there are at least four different kinds of Sharia law within Sunni Islam alone, and a separate one within Shia Islam. So there's all these different variants, and countries have varying degrees of Sharia. I don't think any one particular country has it in its purest form, but different countries in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia have various forms of Sharia law or various applications of Sharia law. Can you tell us a little bit about how Sharia law actually translates it to itself, what it's like living under it? So we talk a lot
Yeah.
about the oppression of women under Sharia, the oppression of non-Muslims, minorities, ethnic and religious minorities. Can you expand on that a little bit and how it varies from one Muslim country to another?
Oh, yeah, and it does vary considerably. And what you just put is something important. Islamic scholars and clerics recognize that we human beings are the middleman interpreting the words of Allah, and so they understand that they're doing their best, if you will, to interpret the sacred words of the Quran. And there is a wide variety of opinions on this. Is it consistent with any sort of democracy, for example? Is it consistent with any sort of free speech, for example? And so it varies a great deal from country to country. Now, in Iran, you'll have a very extreme view which executes people for homosexual acts, for example. That is a key part of Sharia law. Sharia law calls for the execution of homosexuals. And there are places, Hamas very much wants to enact that, has shown that they enact stuff like that. Iran has, just in the last couple of years, Iran has executed people for blasphemy. Just in the last few years, Iran has arrested women for not simply not wearing the hijab at all, for not wearing it properly. And of course, caused a bunch of protests in Iran just in the last years. But hundreds of women were killed or arrested trying to protest what happened to one woman who simply disappeared and died in an Iranian prison for not wearing the hijab properly. That's what we're talking about, more consistent application of Islamic law in a consistent way. We see in Saudi Arabia a sort of, it's horrific to even think of it. Women couldn't, in effect, leave their homes alone without a male chaperone. They couldn't drive cars, forget kind of equal rights. There are other places in the Arab Muslim world where if a woman complains about being raped, well, she was a married woman, well, she needs to be executed for adultery, even though she was a victim of rape. That's happened in other places in the Arab world just within the last few years. So while some places are starting to ease up a little bit, mind you, like in Saudi Arabia, other places apparently are not budging an inch. And among these, I would include Hamas, certain of the Arab states, Iran. You know, when the Ottoman Empire fell apart over 100 years ago at the end of World War I, Ataturk came to power and specifically wanted a more secular Muslim country in Turkey. That unfortunately has eroded this devotion to Ataturk type secular government has eroded within Turkey. So Turkey is one of the Muslim places where I would say is heading in the wrong direction, putting more and more of Sharia type demands into their law. But it will vary, and it does vary dramatically from country to country. Um, some places are getting a little better, like I say in Saudi Arabia, about women leaving the house without a male chaperone or being able to drive a car or something. But there doesn't appear to be any movement whatever in other places. And some places appear to be actually heading in a more medieval direction.
Let's talk a little bit about Sharia in non-Muslim majority countries, because I was actually quite surprised in doing research for this episode to discover that there are Sharia courts often dealing with, for example, family law, domestic issues in European countries, in the United Kingdom, in North America. Now, perhaps you could provide a little explanation here. So I understand that there's, for example, canon law that applies to Catholics, and you have that in various countries. There's Jewish law that applies to Jewish subjects. But I think the idea there is that these legal codes have to work within the framework of a given country, a given European or North American country. They can't conflict with it. But what exactly is the status of a Sharia court, say a family court in the United Kingdom, in North America? How compatible is that with the law of the land, broadly speaking?
Well, in a civilized Western country, there's freedom of religion, and religion informs a great many people's ethics. As objectivists, we know that metaphysics and epistemology are the foundations for an ethics. And so a person's religion is going to be the source of the religious code they follow. So if you are, let's say, a Jehovah's Witness, and you don't want to celebrate certain holidays, or if you're Orthodox Jewish and you can't work on the Sabbath, for that's up. You're free. You're free to enact personally the moral code. Now, as I say, the Torah was originally meant as a code as well. But let's face it, in any civilized country, the Torah is simply a moral code which has no legal binding authority on anyone, nor should it have any influence on anyone. In the United States, for example, if I were to say, even just the posting the Ten Commandments in a public school in the States is probably, they're trying to do it. Supreme Court's knocked them down, said they can't even post the Ten Commandments. That's private morality. And many states in the United States have outlawed Sharia law in some of its particulars and in any legal impact or influence on the law. Similarly, in Canada, as I understand it, it has been rejected as a basis for law. But in Ontario, in Great Britain, you actually, as you point out, there are actually places where it's used to arbitrate within the Muslim community cases of divorce, child custody, things like that, domestic cases. And so today in Great Britain, in Ontario, and there are places in the United States where people want this to happen, Sharia law is allowed to be part of a legal arbitration of a legal dispute, say in a family law matter. That's the extent of it so far in the West, but there are people demanding ever more and ever more role for Sharia law to govern the Muslim community within a Western country. But so far, Great Britain, Canada, and the United States have resisted having it become any official part of beyond a arbitration of domestic matters. Now, ask me, I think we shouldn't even recognize it legally as a valid basis for arbitration. It is sexist. It is oppressive. It is not about individual rights. And so any legal proceeding based on Sharia law, in my view, is corrupt. So even to that extent, Sharia law should not be recognized in Western countries. If in private Muslims want to enforce that code of morality, the government should absolutely shouldn't touch it with a 10-foot, 100-meter pole, in my view.
One point that comes up from that, an argument from critics of Islam, and there's a whole, I've noticed in North America, maybe in Europe as well, there's a kind of anti-jihadist or counter-jihadist movement. So the argument goes something like this, that Muslims see Sharia law as the law, the divinely inspired law, and all other legal systems they regard as man-made and artificial. And there's this idea in Sharia that it applies not only to Muslims, but that non-Muslims, us kafirs, us infidels, that we're in a sense bound by this, or that we have to be controlled by this as well. And so, and some critics have pointed out how there are some sense in which we in the West now seem to be gradually bound by aspects of Sharia law. Like, for example, the taboo over images of Muhammad. You mentioned earlier the Danish cartoon controversy, or the idea of that we're now bound by these blasphemy laws. Think of, for example, of the fatwa on Salman Rushdie, the attacks on American publishers and translators of his books. So is Sharia an actual danger to us here in the West? Is it an existential threat?
Well, I remember when there were people who were being shot and killed or stabbed and were simply drawn images. It was a tremendous controversy several years ago. And the most disturbing thing was not what I heard from any Islamic extremist, that I expect, but from the president of the United States at the time, Barack Obama, who said, America is not a place where you can offend religions. America is all about not hurting people's religious feelings. Well, that is totally dangerous. No, freedom of speech must include the right to offend, to blaspheme in your face. And when a politician says, well, American tolerance about different religions really amounts to not offending anyone, he has totally missed the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Freedom of speech and freedom of religion in America must include the right to offend other religious groups. A criticism of, and by the way, a criticism of a religion is in no way bigotry. If I say Islam is evil, just as I often say Christianity is evil, I am in no way being bigoted. I'm making an ideological criticism, that evaluative criticism of their moral codes. And that has to be protected speech. That has to be the protected freedom of religion. It is not to be protected against being offended. So if someone burns a Quran, which someone did in the Obama administration, the president should not come out and say, it's the guy who burnt the Quran who's the bad guy. It's anyone who would do violence because of that who is the bad guy. For example, when Gaddafi fell and there was the violence in Libya, what was all about? We were told by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and President Barack Obama that it was this offensive video that caused us all this kind of violence against U.S. interests in Libya. Well, wait a minute here. You mean religious fanatics were behind this? There's nothing sympathetic to that, and yet it was presented as though, well, gee, we can only expect violence if anti-Muslims produce anti-Muslim behavior like videos, burning Qurans, drawing the Prophet. A friend of mine actually, in Texas, just a few short years ago, got shot up, and there was a Draw Muhammad that got shot up. The Draw Muhammad contexts that need protection, that have the right here, ladies and gentlemen. No one has a right to go shoot up a Draw Muhammad contest. Okay, if we get to the point where we say in the West we are somehow at fault for offending the sensibilities of Muslims, we've started down the dark, dark path towards, by implication, enforcing Sharia law, whether at a moral consensus level or a legal level. But it begins with that moral consensus level. Gee, isn't it wrong to draw the Prophet? No, it is not. There's nothing wrong with drawing the Prophet, morally speaking. And anyone who would take offense to the point that they would commit a crime or do violence because someone else has drawn the Prophet, they're the problem. They're the savage. They're the ones who need to shut up and get over it. Sorry, Muslims.
Yeah, and lest anyone think that we're merely picking on Barack Obama here, but there have been Republican presidents who've expressed this idea that, well, we don't want to offend the Muslim people. Both George Bush Sr. and Jr. So during the Salman Rushdie controversy, it was George Herbert Walker Bush. And then during the Danish cartoon controversy, it was George W. Bush who said, well, violence is bad, but we're talking about people's religion. We don't want to insult anybody else's faith. So there's been quite a bit of cowardice on both sides of the
Oh, it's
political aisle.
disgusting. In the wake of September 11th, when thousands of innocent Americans were killed in New York City and Washington, and on that plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, people were killed. And what does the President of the United States immediately do? Within days of 9/11, he says, this is not about Islam. It has nothing to do with Islam. It's in no way connected to Islam. He refused to name the actual cause of the violence, which is Islam. Now, Islam, of course, people should have freedom of religion to be Islamic, but to deny the role of Islam in terrorism in our time is invasion of the worst. It is the religion of Islam which has motivated the organized terrorism of our time, by and large. You can see it on October 7th. In southern Israel. You could see it on 9/11. You could see it in France in the Nice bombing of 2016, the killing of people with relation to Charlie Hebdo, people getting their throats cut on the streets of Amsterdam. I could go on and on and on.
The last point I want to talk about is the implications of this for immigration. So those of us who tend to be pro-freedom, we tend to be against arbitrary restrictions on immigration to the extent, and I think it's necessary to stress this, to the extent that people are rights-respecting, law-abiding, productive, self-supporting. We basically believe in the free movement of people across borders, but sometimes I've gotten into some discussions with European objectivists. When they hear North American objectivists say, yes, we're pro-immigration, we're in favor of open borders, the Europeans say, come on, dream, come to Europe, come and see what a clown show we've got coming in, where there's Muslims overrunning all these European countries, in the United Kingdom as well. Are there consequences to how we should think about immigration, which come from Sharia law and from the potential danger of people applying Sharia law in the West?
Well, I think immigration absolutely is a right. It's as an American, it's my right to hire a foreigner. It's that foreigner's right to move around and come into America, all other things being equal. But in the case of physical threats, I think a country does have a right to maintain a border and to exclude people who are objectively physical threats to citizens within that country. So terrorists, criminals, even people I think with deadly infectious diseases can be filtered at the border. I'm not in favor of zero border. I think that there should be a border, but as with every other law, for the physical protection of the citizens, their protection against the initiation of physical force. And if someone is a terrorist, and if someone is saying, if some, I mean, literally, one of these "Death to America" chanters, surely America has a right to keep out someone who's yelling "Death to America." That is an overt threat, and just Islam are absolutely in the category, and I would include the countries of Europe with a right to do that. The other thing is the degree to which those European countries appease the Muslim community when they get there, making concessions about Sharia law, making concessions about their called, rights. They don't have a right to engage in domestic violence. They don't have a right to engage in rape, even though it appears to be permitted under Sharia law in certain circumstances, rape and domestic violence. And so European, Western civilized countries need to have a very clear moral stance about this, and in conjunction with the idea that, yeah, suspicious jihadists can be excluded from immigration, it seems to me, insofar as they are threatening violence against the West, believe in the imposition of Sharia law, and call for the destruction of Western civilization. Under those circumstances, those are precisely the circumstances, it seems to me, under which a country has a right to exclude someone. I would make a distinction between all Muslims and those who advocate violence. And as I say, I think that when Muslim immigration in this way, Western countries cannot sanction in any way the continued behavior, savage, violent behavior permitted and encouraged under Sharia law. Sharia law is a law code, but it's a law code that enshrines the violation of individual rights. Let me repeat, it is a law code which does the very opposite that any moral legal code must do, protect individual rights. It has nothing to do with that. You can't say what you want, you can't believe what you want, you can't dress as you like, you can't have a romantic partner of your choice. No, your freedoms as an individual are wiped out systematically, from freedom of religion and freedom of speech to sexual privacy. All of them are against Sharia law. Sharia law is the enemy of Western liberalism. Sharia law is the enemy of individual rights and freedom, as the only way to understand it. And the West has to have that kind of moral clarity to make sure that we are not culturally overrun, if you will. But that's a moral question. That's up to us intellectuals to make sure that happens. And it's up to the government not to sanction the ongoing behavior that this evil moral code calls for.
Absolutely. Well put. Let's check in with our producer, Daniel. Do we have any comments or super chats from our viewers?
We have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. And we have the reality show upcoming in just about a minute and a half. We're going to talk about Israel at the Olympics, reliving Europe's darkest hour.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you to all our viewers for joining us. Apologize for the technical difficulties, but we'll just blame it on Iran. So thank you, James, for a stimulating discussion as always, and I look forward to seeing all of you. James and I will be back in a few days, assuming that neither one of us is fatwad between now and then. Thank you all very much, and see you soon.
Take care.